Hi, Toops here from Team CGS, welcome! Now, you may not give a damn about game designers, especially those with superstar egos, and we know who they are. Because what's important here are the games themselves, right? Well, that's kind of short-sighted, because where would we be without the minds behind these games? Before I go on, a little about what annoys me about some of these superstars. Who else here hates when they have the name of the game's designers plastered all over the damn box? I mean, to me that stinks of selfishness, as if to say, hey look, I'm the only person who deserves praise and I was the only person involved in the whole project. Yes, Sid Meier, I detest the fact that you do this with your games, for it's stupid and has no place in this day and age. It's as if he doesn't want to be part of a list of forgotten greats and he rams his name down your bleeding throats. Goodness me. Anyway, today's generation of games didn't just materialise out of thin air. No, believe it or not, there was a time when guys, and shock horror even girls, spent their hours creating games at home in their bedrooms. They were part of a cottage industry known as the bedroom coding or homebrew scenes. In the good old days, when I was a lad, video games were only for geeks. Yes, I have to raise my hand up there. But games back then were totally different to the games industry we know and love today. It's important to remember that many of the game ideas of today originate from those very geeks. Sorry, pioneers. However, back then they were created for a love of some sort, usually a love of the game itself, rather than for a multi-million-dollar business deal as usually happens today. As was typical of the time, designers were offered bonuses of cash and stock options, if they were lucky, though because many of them did not come from a business background, while the companies made millions, the designers only made peanuts.
Well, as you can see, I ain't doing too badly for myself, and I don't regret not taking that $1 million paycheck.
Well, it's only $1 million, man. What's $1 million? Have you got any spare change?
So, who are these people who've fallen by the wayside, and what contribution did they produce to warrant a video on the subject? Well, there's Eugene Jarvis. Eugene is one of the few guys within the industry that can honestly claim, and with a straight face too, to have affected every generation of video game ever made. Yep, that's right folks, he was kind of like the American equivalent of Shigeru Miyamoto, though maybe not as good looking. He created Smash TV, Defender, and even Robotron. Oh, by the way, if you think today's games are hard, then give Robotron a shot. In fact, if you can complete the game, I'll give you $100, and I'll even try to throw in a kiss from Eugene himself. Okay, that's a lie, but you can always have a kiss from me instead. Eugene also created the legendary Cruisin' USA. Well, legendary for being absolute shite, that is, but we'll forgive him for that. Back in 1979 there was a game called Adventure, designed by Warren Robinette. This guy was a bit of a rebel, see, because he created a secret room unbeknownst to the Atari executives. Had they found out about this little prank, he would surely have lost his job, and because of this he never told anyone about this room, not even his closest friends, until some 12-year-old brat wrote a letter to Atari detailing his little discovery. As luck would have it, it caused a gaming sensation that lives on to this very day, for it would turn out to be the very first Easter egg within a video game. In the early 1970s, a guy named Gunpei Yokoi joined Nintendo's ranks and would oversee the company's transition from card and toy manufacturer to video gaming powerhouse. In fact, Gunpei's contribution to the company's success should not be underestimated because he, together with Shigeru Miyamoto, helped to shape the Nintendo we know and love today. Gunpei was the creator of the early Game & Watch series of pocket handhelds, as well as Metroid, but arguably his most important contribution, however, was in creating the Game Boy, for it was thanks to the Game Boy that Nintendo managed to stay afloat for so many years. In fact, were it not for Gunpei's invention, Nintendo would surely have gone the same way as Sega did, having to pull out of the hardware market entirely, especially since Sony's PlayStation dominated the home market from the mid-1990s onwards. According to some sources, Gunpei was disgraced for having created the Virtual Boy, though because of his long service to Nintendo was never publicly denounced by the company. Many believed, however, that his subsequent departure was due in part to the Virtual Boy's commercial failure, leading Gunpei to eventually set up his own company. Gunpei sadly passed away in a motoring accident in 1997, though had already cemented his place as one of the greatest masters of the video gaming world, especially as it was he that mentored a young Shigeru Miyamoto who would eventually go on to become the greatest games designer that's ever lived. Nowadays we accept that a game's soundtrack is an important part of the overall enjoyment, and so we should. Indeed, there are now hundreds that are dedicated solely to music itself, such as Rock Band, Parappa the Rapper, and Rez, but to name just a few. To put this into perspective, let me add my own personal soundtrack to this Halo introduction, then add a more fitting epic accompaniment.
Somewhere over the rainbow.
See the difference? However, developers never took the soundtrack too seriously, primarily due to the limited capabilities of the actual sound chips themselves at the time. But back in 1985, there was a guy called Rob Hubbard, who was one of the first guys to realise the potential for added enjoyment if the game had a great soundtrack. Having worked for the legendary Gremlin graphics and doing things with the Commodore 64's SID sound chip that were never thought possible, Hubbard would go on to work for Electronic Arts, becoming the first person in the company's history devoted purely to creating music and sound within their games, International Karate being one of his all-time greatest achievements. Next up we have Donna Bailey, and the first female on the list. Not only that, she was one of the first female programmers in the whole industry during the early 1980s. Donna helped to create one of the all-time greats, Centipede, together with Ed Logg, where the player has to defend against ever-encroaching enemies. It was also one of the first games to have a significant female player base, yes, exactly 20 years before Skies of Arcadia, something unheard of at the time, remembering that video games up until the early 2000s were the preserve of spotty male geeks only. Let's move back over to the UK then, and to the absolutely gorgeous looking Anita Sinclair. Anita co-founded a games company called Magnetic Scrolls in the mid-1980s, though is rather unfairly perhaps best remembered for her astounding beauty, for the industry was never famous for its beauty queens now, was it? Underneath this attractive exterior, however, lay a formidable businesswoman, having spearheaded her own company on the back of her very own savings, and having secured one of the biggest deals of the time with Rainbird Software, a satellite company owned by the telecom giant BT. Most of us have heard of the game Deus Ex, created by the legendary Warren Spector, though there's few who'll know that a game using the same name had already been released way back in 1984. That game was called Deus Ex Machina and was created by British developer Mel Croucher and released on the ZX Spectrum, MSX and Commodore 64. The game was unique in featuring an audio cassette that contained voices from the likes of John Pertwee, who also featured in our Discord retrospective, together with the fully synchronised background music. It was one of those games from the period that was way ahead of its time in terms of ideas, very much like Elite on the BBC Micro B, and based on the work of Shakespeare's As You Like It pastoral comedy. Sandy White created Ant Attack, the very first true isometric game both for the Spectrum and Commodore 64, back in 1983 and 1984 respectively. The game had you playing either a man or a woman who would enter within the city walls to rescue their partner from giant ants. White's achievement is all the more prominent when we remember that Ant Attack was also the first game that allowed the player to choose either a male or a female character, something not even Fable on the original Xbox managed to implement 21 years later, as well as many others viewing the game as the beginning of the survival horror genre, some 9 years before Alone in the Dark. White would also later release Zombie Zombie, which likewise borrowed on the same isometric viewpoint. Back over the pond to the US then, and to Dave Thurer. Dave was a pioneer because not only did he create such golden age greats as Missile Command, but also Tempest and iRobot, the very first game to display filled 3D polygon graphics. He's also known for having apprehended a criminal in his Porsche 928 after a drunk driver hit a 15-year-old boy, causing lifelong paralysis, proving that this guy was indeed a legend in more ways than one. There may be a few of you who don't realise that Sega, yet the guys behind Sonic, Outrun, Sega Rally, Knights and countless other classics, was initiated by an American businessman. Yep, that's right, this guy's name was David Rosen, who after a merger between Rosen Enterprises and Service Games, formed Sega Enterprises. Rosen is etched into my memory banks for having pioneered my favourite ever games company. Next up is Toby Gard. Toby is credited as the man behind the Tomb Raider series. Yep, the ultra sexy explorer who got many young lads tugging away at their joypads from the mid-90s onwards. Oh, I miss those late nights with Lara, let me tell you. Gard is held in high esteem for having left core design due to creative differences, even though Lara Croft had become an international success, especially over in the United States. After the subsequent failure of the series under Core's leadership, as demonstrated by the appalling Tomb Raider Angel of Darkness, Eidos changed development over to the highly respectable Crystal Dynamics, where Gard was employed once again to do his thing. Tomb Raider Legend, Anniversary and Underworld remain obvious examples of how the game should have progressed had Gard been given the creative freedom he was originally denied at Core. If you haven't played the latest versions, then shame on you. Beyond Good and Evil was released in 2003 and was without a doubt one of the most criminally overlooked games of all time. It was designed by a chap called Michel Ancel, a French designer working under Ubisoft. The game combined the best elements of Pokemon Snap with his other famous game Rayman, where a great deal of thought had gone into creating an engrossing adventure game and story within which the player could take shots using their camera along the way. It's now available in HD on PSN and Xbox Live, so I would seriously recommend you grab it before the planned sequel is released. Yukio Futatsugi had worked for many years as leader of the famed Team Andromeda, one of Sega's internal though separate development teams during the Sega Saturn era. He, together with Manabu Kusunoki, helped to spearhead the cult Panzer Dragoon series on the Sega Saturn, their final swan song being the massively underrated epic Panzer Dragoon Saga in 1998. Sadly, the company was dissolved soon after, and many of its members went on to work for other companies such as Sony's Polyphony Digital. Futatsugi would eventually work for Microsoft Game Studios over in Japan, though is now part of Grounding Inc. During the Commodore 64 era, a guy known as Tony Crowther, also known as Anthony Crowther, was a legend amongst the cognoscenti, even at the time, primarily because he created hits such as Monty Mole on multiple formats. These would later include the C64, Amiga, CD32, PC, PlayStation and Sega Dreamcast. Having worked for Gremlin Graphics after having left school at the tender age of 16, and eventually becoming one of the company directors, Crowther would eventually leave to set up his own company, Wizard Development. Sadly, Gremlin would be taken over by Infogrames, something that probably cost him a cushy directorship and share options. But in typical Crowther fashion, he replied, "My problem was I enjoyed writing computer games, and being in a company just didn't appeal to me. All I wanted was for someone to sell me games."